Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for giving me an hour of your time to talk about this. Full disclosure to start off, it is a bit complicated. It's probably quite stressful for you guys, right? So I am going to do my best to keep this kind of upbeat, targeted, as useful as I possibly can. Obviously, there's no substitute for individual legal advice, so do come back to us if you need a bit more help with this stuff, and we will be only too happy to help. You're welcome to email me with any questions after the webinar. I think my details are going to be in the follow-up email that Carissa will probably send. So without further ado, we will get into it. This is what I'm going to cover today. So number one, minimum salary increases. What's gone up and by how much? I think this is the big one, and I'm guessing the reason why most of you are here today. So I'm going to tackle that first. Next on my list, transitional arrangements. When do they apply and how do they work? By this, I mean the rules which will apply now after 4th of April, but to workers already on the skilled worker route. So we'll talk about that. Number three, salary discounts. Happily, they still exist. We'll talk about the new entrant rate, the new immigration salary list, which has replaced the old shortage occupation list. Number four, a little bit about the care sector, a special case. I'm not going to spend heaps of time there, but it is worth a mention because I know we've got some care providers on the call. Last couple of bits are new system, new SOC codes, a few minutes there. Supplementary employment at number 6. It might be helpful for you to know a little bit about that because the provisions have changed. And finally, I will conclude with some of my final thoughts and some hopefully practical, useful tips on what you should be doing right now to continue sponsoring workers. So before I get into all of that, I've got further reading. So these are two of our blogs that I've written the second one, my colleague's written the first one about making sense of the 2024 changes. So the first one is about minimum salary. The second one's about the care sector specifically. As Carissa said, the slides are going to be sent around later. So I highly recommend you click these links when you get the slides and read these articles. As I say, first one really targeted explanation of the minimum salary requirement post-April, and the second one specific to the care sector. So if you are employing in care, that could be well worth a read. So let's dive into the actual content. Where are we starting? We're starting with minimum salary increases. So I've said what's gone up and by how much. As I say, I think this is probably what's going to be most concerning to the employers of sponsored workers. The new rules are not straightforward, unfortunately. We were kind of drip-fed information over the course of several months before April. But now the new system's in place as of the 4th of April, we can be a lot more confident about what the requirements are. I'll talk through the general position in this section. So remember that this is the general position. There are discounts available, but I will talk about discounts later in the webinar. What I want to share with you today then is my own personal method for working out the minimum salary that you need to pay a sponsored worker in any given situation. So when I've got a client, every time I'm talking to a client about minimum salary, I will have had this conversation with some of you on the call. Some of you are my lot. I'm sitting down and doing this following method, usually with an old-fashioned pen and paper because it's how I do maths. Because I'm not very good at maths, but this method will work for whatever sponsorship you're undertaking, but you need to make sure that you're plugging in the right figures, okay? And the figures are going to change depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So this is my method. You must always pay sponsored workers in excess of the 3 things in this table, okay? So in excess of each of these 3 things. Going to take each of them in turn. So firstly, the general minimum threshold. As you can see on the left, this used to be 26,200. It's now 38,700. The logic behind that new figure is that 38,700 is the median pay for all eligible occupations, which I understand to mean that if you lined up the average person working in each eligible occupation from lowest to highest paid, the guy right in the middle is being paid 38,700, and that's why the government has chosen that figure, I think. Secondly, the going rate. While the general minimum threshold is the same across all occupations, the going rate is specific to each job role. So that was always the case, and it still is. You can find these going rates at Appendix Skilled Occupations, where they're all set out in a really long and confusing table. Again, the going rates are being increased to the median rate of pay for each job role. They used to be the 25th percentile. The median is technically the 50th percentile. So that just means that some of these increases are really quite substantial. So there you've got general minimum threshold, 38,700 for all job roles, and going rate, which differs from one job role to another and can be found in appendix skilled occupations. Third and final in my table is the hourly rate. That is also increasing by almost £5 an hour. So from £10.90 to £15.88 per hour. So if I'm advising a client, I've got all these things written out in front of me. What am I going to do with these figures? Here we go. So now all of these things act together. So you need to make sure that the salary you're paying meets or exceeds all of them, as I've got at the top bullet point there. No one of them is more important than the others. So don't make the mistake of thinking the general minimum threshold is the be all and end all. It is important, but equally the going rate and the hourly rate can also, especially if they're higher, they can be equally, if not more important. Another important thing to remember is my second bullet point here, which is pro-ratering. The general minimum threshold needs to be prorated for anything over 48 hours a week. So you're probably only going to prorate that upwards, prorata that upwards. The going rate, however, needs to be prorated for anything that isn't 37.5 hours a week. So you'll find yourself kind of prorating that all over the place, although it's unlikely to get you into much trouble if you forget to prorata it downwards. So yeah, just to review, general minimum threshold, good for anything up to 48 hours a week. Going rate needs to be prorated for anything that isn't 37.5 hours a week. Okay. Yes, that's all I wanted to say on that. So next slide. I have got an example. So is it time for you to do my job? I've got an example here, but there's no pressure at all. I just think if you're the kind of person who learns by doing, then go for it. But I'm not going to pick on anyone. I'll just go through the answer in a couple of minutes. So if you'd rather take a minute or two to drink your coffee rather than do the example, then that's absolutely fine. So here is my example. I've got Dave is a US citizen sponsored after 4th of April 2024 as a business development manager. He wasn't on the skilled worker route prior to this sponsorship. He will work 40 hours a week for his sponsoring employer. So if you want to, have a go at working it out. There is a little bit more information for me to give you on the next slide. So examples at the top. This is the information you'll need. And remember, we're looking at the post-April system, which is highlighted by that arrow. So you will need to know that the normal general minimum threshold of 38,700 applies. The job role falls under new SOC code 3556. The going rate, is listed in Appendix Skilled Occupations as 52,500 per year or 26.92 per hour. And finally, the usual hourly rate of 15.88 applies. So I will literally just have a couple of minutes if you want to have a look at that, see what you can do with pro-ratering and things like that, and then I'll talk through the answer.
Just a quick interruption. I've noticed a couple of people saying they can't hear. Is that a problem across the board? If you can hear us, just let us know. Okay, thanks for confirming. The people who can't hear, well, I was gonna get some advice, but they can't hear me, so I'll put it in the chat box.
Yeah, just another minute or so and then I'll keep things moving. Okay, let's have a look at the answer. So, strictly speaking, the answer is a minimum of £55,993.60 per year, although I'd accept 56,000. So these are how the various thresholds work out. So the general minimum threshold we know is 38,700. And that's what applies here. This would only need to be prorated if Dave was going to work more than 48 hours a week, remember. So, and we know he isn't, he's going to work 40 hours a week. So 38,700 stands. And you don't prorata that one downwards, you only ever prorata it upwards. So that never drops below 38,700 unless a discount applies, but we're parking that for now. The second threshold we need to worry about is the going rate, and that is given as an annual and an hourly figure. So this is the important one here. So that we said the annual salary was going to be 52,500. That's the threshold. And the hourly rate for that is £26.92 per hour. Now remember that you need to prorata this for anything which isn't 37.5 hours per week. And Dave's going to work 40. So the most precise way to do this calculation is based on the hourly rate. So you would do, or I would do, 26.92. That's the hourly rate we got from Appendix Skilled Occupations, times 40 hours per week, and times 52 weeks per year. And that's how I got 55,993.60. A word on the hourly rate, because it's important not to forget about that. On this occasion, the hourly rate of 15.88, that is kind of overridden by that higher hourly rate that forms part of the going rate. Okay, so the going rate hourly rate was 26.92. The general hourly rate is 15.88. So on this occasion, that's kind of overridden, but that won't always be the case. So it is important not to forget about that hourly rate one. You'll see at the bottom that before the 4th of April 2024, if I'd given you this example, if you were Dave's sponsoring employer, you could have paid him 37,440 instead. So that really does show you, the significance of these increases. Okay, so I hope that's making some sense. Obviously, it is complicated. These are a few little thoughts of mine on the new salary threshold. So, I mean, as I've alluded to, 38,700 is a really high general minimum threshold. It's a 40% increase on the pre-April figure of 26,200. So we are looking at a significant increase. Second bullet point, there's not really any phasing for new applicants. So you might be familiar that there are changes happening in the world of family visas as well. So the partner visa earnings threshold, that's also increased to the same figure of 38,700. But they're doing that gradually throughout this year and next. So this kind of stepped increase. It's just gone up to 29,000. It's then going to go up, I think, to 34.5 before it lands at that 38,700, pending a general election. The work salary thresholds, by contrast, went up overnight, unless the work is already sponsored, in which case transitional provisions will help you out. But I think that's just a different way of approaching it. Is it likely to deter sponsorship then? I think the short answer is yes, probably. It's such a big increase in salaries. The government's kind of stated intention, they were very upfront about it, was to bring migration figures down. And I think certainly in the world of work visas, that will probably work. So that is everything I want to say about minimum salary. Next, transitional provisions. So if you did have any questions about minimum salary, I'm very, very happy to come back to them, but I'll come back to them at the end, as Carissa said. So just pop them in the chat box and we'll go through them at the end. The next thing I want to talk about is transitional provisions. So this is a lovely bit of legal jargon, which nobody likes, even me. So it's okay to think of it as a bit of a halfway house, if you like. Transitional provisions, first of all, are a good thing. They are a more generous middle ground between the old system and the new. So if you find yourself coming under the transitional provisions, although it's a bit of legal jargon, it is actually a good thing. Second bullet point here, transitional provisions, it's a useful way to think about it as only kicking in when an event happens, right? So the most common events will be when you extend a sponsored worker's visa, or a worker already sponsored by another employer moves into your employment. So if you effectively pinch someone else's sponsored worker, you're going to be able to benefit from transitional provisions, which is worth bearing in mind. Now, all of that means that you don't need to do anything to keep sponsoring your existing sponsored workers, okay? Apart from the minimum salary increase, like national minimum wage increase, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So That's a little bit about what transitional provisions are. Do they apply to me? So the first question you're going to need to ask yourself is, can I fall under these transitional provisions? On this slide, I've got a rather helpful flowchart designed by a colleague of mine. Remember that you only need to worry about this flowchart when one of those events happens, okay? So I've got that in a box on the right where it says you start here when one of these events happens, such as extending a sponsored worker's visa or your new hire is switching from employment with another sponsoring employer. So the crucial thing is for this to work, the worker you're trying to sponsor should already be on the skilled worker route, whether that's for you or somebody else. Whoops, don't do that. So let's have a look at the flowchart. So it is, yeah, as I've said, is the individual you're sponsoring already on the route? If it's yes, transitional provisions will apply. If it's no, then you're looking at the post-April rules. So the flowchart really does kind of simplify things. To bring that into sort of practical terms, some of you will already be sponsoring workers. So say, for example, you've got a worker whose certificate of sponsorship and visa both expire on the 1st of August this year. When you come to apply for and assign their new certificate of sponsorship, that's when you're entering this territory, the territory of this flowchart, and not before. So for now, you could continue sponsoring that worker at whatever rate you're currently paying them, with the exception of national minimum wage increases. So we know a little bit more, hopefully, about when transitional provisions apply, but how do they actually work? What do they do? Well, I said they were more generous, and there's actually not a huge amount more that you need to know. Here's my table from earlier in the webinar with a new column in yellow for the transitional provisions. And as I said, you'll see this is kind of a halfway house for the general minimum threshold. So it was 26,200. It is 38,700, but if you fall under the transitional provisions, if one of those events is happening and you're continuing somebody's sponsorship, you can benefit from a lower general minimum threshold of 29,000, and I think that's worth having. The going rate, likewise, also increasing. Remember, these are the ones that are specific to each profession, so they're increasing, but it is more moderate than those enormous increases that we see for this post-April system. So remembering Dave from the earlier example, and it was the going rate that really hiked his salary up. The hourly rate is also seeing a more moderate increase. So we know that it's going from 10.90 to 15.88 for everybody else. If you can come under transitional provisions, it's just 11.90, which is actually not too far above the national minimum wage increase, which you should be paying anyway. So yeah, the one thing to remember about transitional provisions, they are your friend, very much a good thing, better than the post-April system. That's all I want to say about those. So next section I've got to talk about is salary discounts. Just bear with me. So everything I've talked about so far, as I said, is the general position. In certain circumstances, you can get discounts, which is always worth having. The headline being salary discounts still available, although they do look a bit different. That was by no means guaranteed. As sort of April loomed, we were not entirely sure that any of these discounts would be retained, and if so, in what form, how much of them would be left. But happily, they have been retained, although, they do look a bit different, particularly the shortage occupation list, which I'll come on to in a second. So first of all, one of the most commonly used rates is the new entrant rate. So I'm going to start there. It was a relief to find out that that was being retained on pretty much the same terms as before. This applies to workers under 26, those switching from the graduate route, or those switching from a student visa after having completed their course. Now, if you're not familiar with that last bit, that is relatively new as well. The last few months they introduced that. So you're no longer able to sponsor a student who's dropping out of the course to switch to your employment. They have to actually finish their course first. So just be careful of that one as well. The effect of this is as set out here. So the general minimum threshold is discounted from 38,700 down to 30,960. The going rate is discounted to 70% of whatever is listed in Appendix Skilled Occupations, but the hourly rate of 15.88 still applies. That's unchanged. In my view, this is still a good discount. It's still a discount worth having. It will still continue to be useful. I think the main difference is, I mean, it's the same. So the going rate was always discounted to 70% for new entrants. Obviously, we're now looking at 70% of higher figures, which results in a higher number, but it's still a far favourable position to you having to pay the sort of full post-April system. And the idea of the new entrant rate is to kind of encourage employers to hire people at the start of their career rather than, you know, give them an opportunity as well as more experienced workers. So I think it will still continue to be useful in that way. Next one I want to talk about is Immigration Salary List, or ISL. So pre 4th of April 2024, it was known as the Shortage Occupation List, which might be familiar to some of you. Post April 2024, it's now known as the Immigration Salary List. What I really want to convey, I guess, on this is that the change is far more fundamental than just a name change. This is not a simple kind of rebranding. There's a lot more going on here. So the general minimum salary threshold is dropped from 38,700 to 30,960 if your job role is on the new immigration salary list. The going rate is not discounted, however, unlike the pre-4th of April system, and I think that's really important. And that hourly rate of 15.88 still applies as well with no discounts. So I'll just talk a little bit more about what's changed here. So in terms of what's the same, the one thing that has stayed the same is that it's still a list of salary reductions for certain roles. There's still a list of roles for which salary reductions apply, but the differences are what's crucial. So the immigration salary list, when you first look at it, especially if you were familiar with the shortage occupation list, the first thing that kind of occurs to you is, wow, it is short. Like there's hardly anything on the immigration salary list. It really is a scaled back version of the shortage occupation list. So I actually read that 30% of all eligible occupation codes for a skilled worker visa, right? So that's any role that you can sponsor. 30% of those roles used to be on the shortage occupation list. Now it's just 8% on the immigration salary list. So it really is a significant reduction. I mean, fortunately, care workers and senior care workers have made the cut, so they're still on the immigration salary list. Some of them are really weird and niche. So I was having a look at it the other day. It's stuff to do with like working with horses, like a pipe welder. Just not roles that I've really come across in practice apart from the care roles, which obviously we're pleased to see kept on the essentially what is a new shortage list. So yeah, immigration salary list really scaled back. The second bullet point under what's different here, no discount to the going rate anymore. And I think that's what's going to significantly reduce the kind of helpfulness, the impact of the immigration salary list. And the third thing, I said it wasn't just a simple rebranding, and I think that's true. So in terms of the name, they've got rid of the word shortage. I think that's quite significant. It's no longer a shortage occupation list, it's an immigration salary list. The government no longer wants us to perceive this as reflecting a shortage in certain roles. It's actually a way for the government to give itself a little bit more control over the job roles which appear on this list. So that's why I say it's a little bit more than just, it's not just been renamed, there's more going on here. So that's the discounts taken care of. Again, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll come back to them. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the care sector because it is a special case. I know we've got some care providers with us today. The care sector remains a special case because we are so reliant on care workers from overseas. That will be news to nobody, I imagine. The government has been forced to recognise that in terms of the salary requirements. I don't think it really wanted to, but it's just a fact of life that we need overseas care workers. So the next slide, I've got the same table that I had earlier on, but don't worry too much about it. It's when I filled this in, it honestly came out a little bit more complicated than what I wanted for this session, especially because the session today isn't care focused. So this table, if you're interested, it will explain to you exactly why the salary requirements are the way they are in care. So if you're interested in that, read this table and that separate blog article that I linked right at the start. Both of those together will give you a better explainer than what I want to do here. So do look out for those when we email the slides around afterwards. For now, I'm going to move on to what's actually useful for you to know, which is the kind of actual position. So this is a sort of shortened version of that same table. So ultimately, and in brief, you will need to pay care workers no less than 23,200 gross per year and no less than £11.90 per hour. So you can see the increases there. And in care, there used to be a discount to 20,480. So that's, there's still a discount because it's not 38,700, but it is going up to 23,200. Same with the hourly rate up to 11.90, which is preferable to the full 15.88, of course. Now that 23,200 represents both the general minimum threshold and the going rate. So remember your pro-ratering, because it comes from the going rate in a way. It's only good for 37.5 hours a week, and it needs to be pro-rated for anything that isn't 37.5 hours a week. Importantly, I've got at the bottom, there are no transitional provisions in care. So if you're sponsoring care workers right now, these are the rates you're going to need to pay the next time the event happens. Unfortunately, the flowchart is not for you. You can't go down the route of transitional provisions. They are just implementing this straight away. So that means the next time an event happens, so if you pinch a skilled worker from somebody else, or you come to extend a skilled worker's certificate of sponsorship, one of your care workers, these are the rates that you need to pay when those events happen, 23,200 or 11.90 an hour. Finally, on care workers, there are a couple of changes which aren't related to minimum salary, and these are on the next slide. So a couple of changes made recently. Care workers no longer able to bring their dependents since the 11th of March 2024. That's a nice one, isn't it? And the second one, employers wanting to sponsor in these two SOC codes, 6135 and 6136, those have changed, will need to be regulated by the CQC. So the first bullet point here about dependents, I think, is pretty vindictive. There are a lot of sponsored care workers in this country because we need a lot of sponsored care workers in this country. They're being penalised in a way that doesn't apply to other roles here because of our reliance on them. Something's not adding up for me. Don't like it. Second one, I actually don't dislike. So there's been a lot in the headlines recently about ethical sponsorship or the lack thereof. I do think requiring CQC registration will go some way to tackling that, albeit at the expense of some genuine and responsible employers who don't want to become CQC regulated for whatever reason. So that's that. It's important to note that unlike for minimum salary and care roles, there are transitional provisions for these two. Okay, so what I said was with salary for care roles, when one of those events happens, you need to pay the full post-April rates, 23,200 or 11.90 an hour. But with these two, there are some transitional provisions. So if you did start sponsorship of a care worker before April 2024, but they didn't yet bring their family members, they still can. So if anyone's kind of thinking they can't do that, then there is scope to do that still. And also their family members can stay when their sponsorship and visa are extended, right? So if you've got a care worker whose sponsorship is ending, say later this year, and they've got partner and a child here from overseas, the partner and child can stay when you extend the visa, because that kind of counts as a transitional provision. I think that's the least they could do, to be honest. So that's at least good to have had confirmed. Equally, if you started sponsorship before the 4th of April 2024 and you weren't CQC regulated, you can extend your workers' sponsorship and visa without needing to register with the CQC. Incidentally, if you're in Wales, then it's just the equivalent of the CQC, which I think is Care Inspectorate Wales. So that's all I want to say here on the care sector. As I said, do read the blog article that I referenced at the start, not only because I wrote it, but also because that is specific to the care sector and tells you a bit more about what you need to know there. So next one is new system, new SOC code. So I've kind of alluded to this, but this is just one to be careful of. So as if all the other changes that I've been through already weren't enough, we also have changing SOC codes to contend with. So the SOC codes are the little 4-digit codes that you use for each job role. We've switched to the new SOC 2020 system from what used to be called SOC 2010, apparently. Here's some common examples. So we've got care workers used to be 6145, they're now 6135. Senior care workers likewise were 6146, they are now 6136. Restaurant manager changed again by 1 digit. Good news for the restaurateurs, chefs are still 5434, so that's at least one thing you don't have to worry about. Somehow I find it more confusing that they've only changed 1 digit. I wish the change was a little bit more dramatic, if anything. But yeah, I just urge you to be extra cautious of this one. Be careful there. Next slide. So getting through it now. Supplementary employment. I just wanted to say something about this because it's a very quick note here because I thought it was worth including. It's one of the few things to be liberalized a bit rather than further tightened. So everything I've talked about so far has been kind of tightening and restricting and limiting the number of migrant workers we might have and the rights of those migrant workers. But this has actually been liberalized. So anyone not familiar with supplementary employment provisions, these govern what, if any, work a sponsored worker is permitted to do outside of the job role they're sponsored for. So you might have workers coming to you saying, okay, I'm contracted with you to do 37.5 hours a week, but can I take some part-time work on the side? And the answer is yes. I mean, pre-April 2024, as I've got on my first bullet point here, they could only undertake supplementary employment in the same SOC code for which they were sponsored, right? But now that's been liberalized a bit and they can undertake separate supplementary employment in any SOC code which is eligible for sponsorship. So they can't go off and do anything at all, but they can do more than they were allowed to before. It still has to be eligible for sponsorship, so still has to be eligible for this skilled worker regime. The other restrictions remain unchanged. So it was always the case that they could never do more than 20 hours per week supplementary employment. And it must be outside of the contracted hours for their sponsored employment. So if you've got set hours in a contract, they need to be working for you during those hours. And if they want to do this 20 hours extra, that needs to be outside of those hours. So just worth knowing a little bit about that in case employees have questions for you. And that brings me to some final thoughts. So I wanted to make this sort of a little bit more practical because as I'm aware there's a lot of information. It's probably a bit vague. After this session, you're going to go back out into the real world and have to implement some of this stuff. So these are the things that you should be doing right now. Number one, make sure you're paying national minimum wage. So hopefully this is news to no one, but in early April, the national minimum wage went up. So the rate for over 23s increased to 11.44. Just a word from a sort of immigration perspective, you don't need to tell the Home Office that you're doing that. If you've increased people's salaries in line with minimum wage, you can just do that. You'd only need to notify the Home Office if you'd reduced their pay for whatever reason. Remember, this applies to all your workers, sponsored and non-sponsored, British, settled or otherwise. Everyone who works in the UK is entitled to national minimum wage. So that's just one to remember. The second one I've got here is following the new regime that I've talked about for fresh sponsorships, where the COS is assigned after the 4th of April 2024. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. The next bullet point, follow the transitional provisions if you possibly can, where where your sponsorship started or the employee's sponsorship started before the 4th of April 2024 and it's continuing, so where there is one of those events that I talked about. And the last bullet point here, remember that if you assigned a COS, if you managed to get your COS assigned before the 4th of April 2024, the old system will still apply. There's normally a 3-month time limit on using a COS, right? So if you assigned the COS before the 4th of April 2024 and the worker has not yet applied for their visa, that's okay. The COS is still good at the salary level that it says on there, and your worker's got 3 months to apply. Now, I'm aware that a lot of people had certificate of sponsorship applications in and pending before the 4th of April 2024. The Home Office, in its wisdom, decided they were just going to sweepingly cancel all of those. So that's not great. If that's happened to you, it's just really frustrating, isn't it? And you're not the only one. It's happening across the board. It was just the policy they took. And there's not much we can do about it, unfortunately. One more slide. So My final thought to you, I guess, is use what is there to your advantage. Can you hire a new entrant under 26, graduate or a student visa instead of a more experienced worker? Because those discounts are still good discounts for new entrants. Can you find workers willing to switch employers? Can you pinch someone else's skilled worker and therefore get in under transitional provisions? Find someone not happy where they are, make them a better offer. It'll be cheaper for you. You can get 5 years potentially, up to 5 years on the skilled worker route, and then they'll qualify for indefinite leave to remain. And if you've treated them well, they just might stay with you and you've saved yourself some money. Third bullet point, retain your own sponsored workers. As I say, it's far cheaper to use transitional provisions for them than hire new. So if you've got workers who are on the skilled worker route already, you're already sponsoring them, keep them happy. When their COS expires, you can extend it on transitional provisions and thereby save yourself some money. So is it worth looking at things like employee benefits packages? Don't kick up a stink about remote working if that's what they want to do, and if you can possibly accommodate it, things like that. And that is the end, I think. So we've finished in good time, about 1:45. So we've got some time for some questions. I don't know if we've had many in the chat, Carissa, if you want to go through them or. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yes, we have a few questions in the chat box, so I'll read them out to you and I can give it a go. So the first one here is from Savina. And so it says, let's say we have someone working 50 hours, so more than 48 hours, for a SOC that has a going rate less than the general minimum threshold. So, and then it says, so I guess we would go with the £38,700. How would we calculate this?
Okay, yeah, top question, really good. So 50 hours a week. You need to always go back to that table that I showed you, the 3 things. So number 1, general minimum threshold, 38,700. It's only good up to 48 hours a week. So what I would be doing is 38,700 divided by 48 times 50. Yeah, that's how you prorata it for a 50-hour working week. 38,700 divided by 48 times 50. I would write that down. The next one I would do is go to the going rate, find the hourly rate for the going rate, and do that times 50 hours per week times 52 weeks per year. And then, for good measure, you go to the hourly rate, which was the third line on the table. You do 50 times the new rate, which is £15.88, and come up with, 50 times 15.88 times 52 weeks a year. Okay, so that should have given you 3 different annual figures. You need to pay in excess of all of them. So if I think you said the going rate was going to give a lower result than 38,700. So it's looking like the general minimum threshold is going to be the highest. But remember that you need to prorata it because it's only good up to 48 hours. So whatever that calculation gave you, 38,700 divided by 48 times 50, I think that's the answer. But it should always be the highest of those 3. And it is always safest just to sit down with a piece of paper and write those 3 things out. That's what I do.
Perfect, thank you. Moving on to the next question here. Oh, sorry, do you have, never mind. Okay, the next question is from Jafar, and it's, how about employees willing to work for Amazon or DPD as delivery drivers? Is that allowed? Based on code 8214, as per the link below, which is the eligible occupations code list on the Gov.uk website. Also, does it work for employees who are already on a sponsored Tier 2 visa issued before April 2024? And I will say I did look at this code and it looks like it's not eligible for a skilled worker visa.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to look it up briefly, but yeah, okay. So I would have a bit of a, well, I did have a bit of a red flag then as you were reading it out. So you remember with supplementary employment, it used to be the case until recently, until the 4th of April, your worker could only do supplementary employment for somebody else in the same SOC code for which you were sponsoring them. So if you're sponsoring them like Dave at the start, he was a business development manager. If you're sponsoring him as a business development manager, he can go work for someone else for 20 hours a week, but only as a business development manager. That was the position before the 4th of April. Now it is liberalised a bit, so Dave could go off and work in a different code that is eligible for sponsorship. So something, I don't know, something like the pipe welder, we know that's eligible for sponsorship, or a care worker. So it's a bit freer. He's not restricted in the same way that he used to be for supplementary employment, but it still has to be a SOC code that is eligible for sponsorship. And everything, I mean, things are eligible for sponsorship if the government has deemed it skilled enough to be capable of sponsorship. And things like delivery drivers are generally not. The other big one is wait staff. So anyone kind of front of house at a restaurant, not generally eligible for sponsorship, but people like chefs in the kitchen are. So you do need to be careful about that, and make sure. I mean, it's not really your responsibility as the employer, but obviously you don't want to lose them as a sponsored worker if anything happened to them and their permission to be here. So yeah, in that case, I would advise him, no, don't go and work for Amazon because it's not eligible for sponsorship, and you could get into hot water if the Home Office found out.
Just to ask as well, sorry, as a follow-up there, Jafar has mentioned that it
Oh,
does say 8214 on the updated list.
Okay.
This list does say it was updated on the 4th of April 2024, but it is saying it's not eligible.
Let me have a look.
Not sure if you know more.
No, I don't. I mean, it's quite specific, so I haven't sort of looked into it. What was the code again? 8214.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the list I'm looking at says it's not eligible for sponsorship, I'm afraid. Just be careful, because if you're in appendix skilled occupations, it's a real hassle to read, and they list all the different occupation codes are on there, but some of them are in a table where it says they're not eligible for sponsorship. So 8214 is in table 6, and if you scroll up to where it says table 6, it says SOC 2020 codes, which are not eligible. So although it's appearing in skilled occupation, appendix skilled occupations, it's in a table that says it's not eligible, which is, yeah, confusing, but there you go.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. All right, next, this is the user's iPhone, so I can't identify them, sorry. But can overseas nurses still be sponsored since nursing is not on the new immigration salary list?
Ooh, good question. I don't know, actually. I would be very surprised if they can't be sponsored. Yeah, okay, so they're eligible for sponsorship. Right, this gets really complicated. So they are eligible for sponsorship. They're not on the immigration salary list, but they are a job that is paid with reference to pay bands. And that is a whole different ballgame. So sometimes when you look in appendix skilled occupations, the going rate is listed and you get an actual number and it says something like 30K. Other times you look in appendix skilled occupations, and this is the case for nurses and a lot of healthcare workers, and it doesn't give you a number. It says see relevant pay band, and it refers then to the NHS Agenda for Change or the Welsh Scottish equivalents, whatever. And those become then a special case. So I don't know off the top of my head what the actual figures are for those. There will be a discount though, because there is a discount to the going rate for occupations that are decided with reference to these pay bands. So that's the best I can do. They're still eligible for sponsorship. You won't have to pay them 38,700. I don't know off the top of my head what you will have to pay them.
But they can be sponsored.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, this next one here is from Niru. One of our workers working with us for 20 hours, but she is on sponsorship with another company. She now wants to come on under their sponsorship, but her job code will change if she comes under their sponsorship. All right, there is a follow-up here as well. If her 3 years of skilled work will be considered for her ILR, and what will be the transitional provisions?
Okay, so the yes to the first one. anytime she has accrued on the skilled worker route will count towards her ILR, whatever code it is. That one I'm happy with. The second one, if you pinch a worker from another sponsoring employer and you change their SOC code, do transitional provisions apply? And I'm sorry, but I don't know off the top of my head. I understand the question. I'm not sure if you have to continue sponsoring them in the same SOC code. Part of me wants to say no, because you're still extending sponsorship of someone who was sponsored pre-April 2024. So that's my answer. I hope you would still get the transitional provisions. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this one is from Sohrab. This is, I have a skilled worker on a SOC code, which is still on the new ISL list, showing at £30,960. They are due to renew their visa in January 2026. So nothing needs to change until then, except minimum wage. They also have dependents. When it's time to provide a new cause, will they need to go to £30,960? Or is there any other discounts, and does it change because they have dependents?
It doesn't change because they have dependents. Let me go back to my own table, hang on. So what are we thinking about here? We're on transitional provisions, aren't we? So what have I said? So when you come to extend that person's sponsorship in January 2026, the transitional provisions will apply to you because you started sponsoring them before April 2024. So I would expect the general minimum threshold to go up to 29,000. The going rate we think is increasing to that figure you've said of 30,960, I think. The hourly rate 1190. I mean, I'm sort of making this up a little bit here, but I think off the top of my head, what you would do is you would put 30,960 into that middle line on this table where it says moderate increases. And then I believe you would have to pay the highest of all of these things. I haven't done this in practice yet. That's why I'm floundering a little bit. But that's kind of my instinct is that's what you would do. And then once you've got those figures, so you've got 29,000 at the top, 30,960 in the middle, 1190 at the bottom. You then need to, I'd then be asking you how many hours a week is he working and starting to pro rata. Then you'd end up with 3 figures in the end, and you need to pay the highest of all of them. Please don't take that as like absolute truth because I'm not 100% sure, but that is what I think.
Okay. The next question here is from Seka +6. Is the minimum pay for care workers sponsored before April 24th £11.44 an hour, I'm assuming?
So now, yes. So if you've got a sponsored care worker, there's no event happening, you're not extending, you're not stealing them from somebody else. They worked for you yesterday and they're still working for you today, or to say it properly, they worked for you on the 1st of April and they're still working for you now. The only thing you need to do for that person is increase their salary in line with national minimum wage, which you should be doing across your organization anyway. If they're over 23, it's 11.44 an hour. You will only need to worry about anything I've said here today, basically, when one of those events happens, which is extending or stealing from somebody else. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And there's one last question here from Jafar again. Assuming an employee was on a SOC code first 3 years, and then on year 4 and 5, he worked on another SOC code, will this individual qualify for ILR after 5 years, given that they were on 2 different SOC codes?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. So it is what makes you eligible for ILR is that you have spent 5 years on the skilled worker route, kind of full stop. There is some problems will happen if you've had any kind of significant break in that time period. So if they stopped being on the skilled worker route, I think it's for like 6 months or more, then it's problematic. But if you've just switched SOC codes, essentially that doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the fact that they're on the skilled worker route. So yes, 5 years as a skilled worker normally equals ILR.
Perfect.
I saw Meryl, who's one of mine, holding something up on a piece of paper. I don't know if you can see that, Carissa. Are
No,
you still
sorry.
trying to hold something up, Meryl, or no? Shake your head if you're not bothered anymore. Don't know if she can hear me. No, don't worry about it.
Okay. So that's the last of the questions in the chat box. Bear with me a second here. I have one question. If that's
Okay.
okay.
Yep.
So something that's definitely tripping people up is the figure of 38,700 pounds. So can you just clarify, is that the salary that you need to pay now?
Yeah, okay. So I think the temptation is to see 38,700 and be like, right, that's it, full stop. That's what I need to pay. That's the increase. But as I've tried to sort of explain a little bit today, if you always think about that table, always think about those three things. If 38,700 is the highest figure when you've done your sums, then yes, that's your answer. But you do need to watch the going rate, and some of the going rate increases are substantial. As we saw with Dave in the example, his going rate gave him a salary of like 50,000 or something. And it was only for a 40 hour working week. So yes, the general minimum threshold, 38,700, is absolutely something that you need to worry about, but it's not the only thing.
All right, perfect. Looks like that's it for questions.
Great.
All right, so we will clue it up there. Thank you all so much for attending. I hope it was helpful. I know the changes are quite overwhelming, so hopefully this broke it down for you and made it a little more clear. If you have any follow-up questions, do feel free to get in touch with us. My follow-up email will have further details about who to contact and all that. And like Michelle, or no, sorry, like I said in the beginning, we will also be sending out the slides and a recording of this session for you to take a look at after. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. See ya.